Hold on. Okay, I was just talking and you couldn't hear me. I think we got that fixed now. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another chat with the Archaeologist. I am your host, Chester Liwosz, the project Archaeologist for the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project, or the primary sponsors of this stream. You'll hear the squeaking in the background. That's my dog. She's going to probably come in and out and visit us throughout the stream. So, yeah. There we go. She'll be back. Don't worry. I think it adds a certain character to these streams. All right, so we have a couple of updates. We've got a couple of updates about the project going on. You know, it's a new year. It's 2021. First off, I want to say thank you to all of our generous donors who have contributed during the last appeal, during the winter appeal. Thank you all so much. Everyone out there, thank you. Secondly, I want to make a shout out to, I don't know if you've noticed in the description of these videos, hold on a sec. There we go. She'll be back, don't worry. In the description of these videos, you might notice that these streams are actually sponsored in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the New Mexico Humanities Council. So I wanted to make sure that proper recognition is given and that my shirt's buttoned up too. So yeah, National Endowment for the Humanities. This wouldn't be possible without the grants from NEH and New Mexico Humanities Council. Next up, we've been getting a lot of questions about tours for 2021. We are hoping to start tours this year at some point in 2021. We're still kind of figuring out where we sit and how we can continue to comply with state health regulations and make this happen. We think that it is possible. So yeah, stay tuned. Tune into these each month, and I'll be giving updates. There's not much that I can actually publicly say right now, but we're working on making tours a possibility, making them happen. It's going to look a little bit different. If you've attended our tours in previous years, we're probably not going to be doing the large public tours with you and a dozen other strangers, at least not immediately, or not until other things change. But yeah, we're working on making this happen. I know there's a lot of interest. We keep getting calls and emails. Thank you all for your interest. Do stay tuned, and we will get back to you when the tours are available. Yeah. So next up, a few announcements about this series is that we're going to be having guest lectures coming in pretty soon. It's funny, she's pretty quiet until I start going, and then now she wants to play. As I said, it's just a part of the stream. So where was I? Yeah. I mentioned last month that one of the things we're doing to change the format for season 2 is to bring on guest speakers, open up guest spots. So we've been talking with several people about this. We have one lined up for next month. So our first guest lecturer will be Dr. Liwosz Bork, who's a professor at Highlands University. So we're hoping to get him on next month. It sounds like everything's in order to make that happen. So yeah, definitely tune in for that one. You'll get to hear someone who's a little bit more interesting than I am. Yeah, and then we've got a couple other lined up for subsequent months. Still talking with a few other folks about scheduling to try to make that happen. So we're getting going on that. Today we're going to talk about archaeology in the news, our regular segment that's added this season, and then we're going to do a audience requested lecture, mini lecture on Mimbres and Mogollon. So yeah, without any further ado, let's get into it. Seem to be my inputs aren't automatically adjusting as I change scenes, which they normally would. So let's see here. There we go. All right. So welcome. Once again, I'm your host, and you all know me by now. We've done the introduction. So let's start off with archaeology in the news. Just having some technical difficulties getting that slide to change there. All right, there we go. All right, first up, Neanderthal kiss and tell. This is a sort of interesting one, I think. And it's based on, the article's rather long and actually briefly recaps a lot of research that's been going on in Neanderthal human interactions for the last few years. First up is kissing. How do we know that humans in the past kissed with Neanderthals? Do we know that? How could you test something like that? Well, one researcher, and let's try to pull the article up, and here's what we know. Who's the researcher here? Um, oh, oh, I don't see the name immediately. It's in the article. Anyhow, this is from testing a set of remains that came out of the Carpathian Mountains, which is a range in Eastern Europe. That's through Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania. You know the Carpathians from lore. So these Neanderthal remains came out and they examined the tooth enamel for any evidence of embedded microbes. So how do microbes get in your teeth? Well, they get ground in when you're eating, but any sort of mouth-to-mouth contact, passage of fluid between mouths, could transfer microbes too. And what the researchers found, which was kind of surprising, was that the microbes found on these Neanderthal teeth diverged from the ones that we see in human teeth about 120,000 years ago. What's so special about 120,000 years ago? Well, Neanderthals have been around for, or they were around for about 400,000 years, or rather 360,000 years, from 400,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago. Sure, someone can pop in the chat if you've got more accurate information and argue with me on that. Point being is that 120,000 years ago means that sometime around then, this this bacteria that was found on these Neanderthal teeth came from a modern human being over to Neanderthals. These particular Neanderthal teeth were pretty late. They were in the, I believe it was 43 to 48,000 year ago range, 48,000 years ago, which is pretty interesting in itself, right? So these bacteria were living with Neanderthals for tens of thousands of years. And that's pretty remarkable. But okay, so what's special about 120,000 years ago? Well, that's about the point that anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, finally was able to leave Africa and establish permanent settlements. First in what's now sort of the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, and then spreading out through there. Of course, in that time, in the Near East, you had Neanderthals. You had Neanderthals in the Near East, Northern Asia, and of course Europe. So this would seem to indicate that there was a divergence between this bacteria and the stuff that the version of this bacteria that stayed with modern humans from basically that point, that initial point of contact. So that's really interesting. That initial contact seems to have included some kissing. Um, of course, the article goes into a little bit more than kissing, and you all may probably know by now that most folks of European and Asian, especially like northern and western Asia, have about 1 to 3% Neanderthal DNA. So I haven't had my own DNA tested, but chances are pretty good that I have between 1 and 3% of Neanderthal DNA. So they're still with us, and there's only one way that we get DNA from Neanderthals. So this isn't necessarily new, but yeah, let's see if we have a picture of yeah, okay. You get the impression of how that happens, right? So there's been more recent study into this, specifically in the movement of entire chromosomes. So one of the studies cited within this article, of course, all references are down in the description, and of course on my ending slides. And of course, the link is on this slide. So one of the interesting things is that over time, we were able to trace how the gene flow goes. Is it Neanderthal men with Homo sapien women? Is it Homo sapien men with Neanderthal women? Is it a mismatch of each? And what we found is that there's actually a change in the Y chromosomes from early Neanderthals to late Neanderthals. So especially those ones from about like 48,000 years ago, getting towards the end that the end point when Neanderthals are kind of disappearing. And what we find is that excuse me, I thought I had that on silent. What we found is that the Neanderthal DNA from, it's a notification that the stream is going. The Neanderthal DNA that they started out with is, in fact, at least the Y chromosomes that Neanderthals start out with disappear. And they're replaced with a Y chromosome that looks very much like the anatomically modern Homo sapiens Y chromosome. So what this seems to indicate is that more often it was Homo sapien men having kids with Neanderthal women. So again, refer you to the image to my right. Yeah. So we all understand how that goes on. Now, this article goes into a lot more detail than that. There's a lot going on. It's pretty lengthy. It covers a lot of different research. So I do encourage you to go check it out. But for this stream, we're going to move on to did humans digest bones? So this recently came up in a video series that a channel that I follow on YouTube, SciShow. Very accessible videos bringing science of all types to a public audience. It's pretty great. Of course, I encourage you to check it out. They're not giving me any kickbacks or anything. I just find them fascinating and entertaining. Usually between 10 and 15 minutes long, so it won't take up a lot of your time either. So SciShow covered different animals that eat bones, and getting towards the end, I think it's the last example in the video, they talk about a study done by anthropologists, specifically by archaeologists, who actually did experimentally address this question of, do humans digest bones? I thought the story sounded familiar, so I had to look back, and yeah, it's familiar because the folks who did the study, Brian Crandall and Peter Stahl, won the Ig Nobel Prize for Humor in Science back in 2013, the Ig Nobel Prize in Archaeology in 2013 for doing this study. And basically what they did is they boiled shrews and ate them as whole as possible, and then then analyzed their own leavings for the next several days afterwards to see uh, if any shrew bones passed through, how many, and what condition they were in. And I think we have a picture of that study too. Yeah, that's about right. Yep. Uh, so yeah, that's pretty funny study. Of course, uh, check out the video on YouTube. You'll learn more about like turtles eating bones and other animals, of course, hyenas. Uh, and then, of course, check out the Ig Nobel Prize. I think the research itself was actually done in the 90s. I want to say like 93 or something. So it took nearly 20 years from the time that they published the paper to the time that they got the prize. But no, that's great that they got the recognition they deserve for such a study. But actually, very useful too. It's very useful to understand what humans can and cannot digest. Not only just shrew bones, but because then we can measure the size and thickness and density of these shrew bones. We can make estimates for say fish bones, for any sorts of bone fragments that might be accidentally ingested when eating a broth, like a bone broth, which typically you break the bone open to get the marrow to cook out into the broth. And so just by studying the shrews, we can make some pretty reasonable inferences about what we're seeing in the archaeological record. Is it missing because it didn't happen, or is it missing because it would have been digested and dissolved? And so there we go. Check that out for a little bit more detail. I don't think I actually have a link to the original paper. I just have a link to the SciShow video, but they've got a link to the original paper in there if you want to follow up on that. All right. So next is the allegedly, controversially, oldest pictograph in the world of a pig in Sulawesi, which is Indonesia. And yeah, so one might even call it wait for it, pictograph. All right. This one's pretty interesting too. And there it is. So this is pretty old, and we've known for a while that the rock art, specifically pictographs in caves or rock shelter contexts in Indonesia, are particularly old and constantly sort of vying for the world's oldest rock art. And the reason why they're preserved here so well and not other places is because these are sheltered areas. They're not necessarily open air. We've talked in previous videos about pictographs in the news, ones in South America that were allegedly 12,500 years ago. There's a lot of controversy around those dates. It's possible because we know people had just arrived in South America around that time, maybe a little bit before, so it's entirely possible, but those are open air sites, and so there's a matter of preservation, and it's very difficult for applied pigments to last that long. But here we have a sheltered area, and how do we know it's so old? Normally we might wonder, like, okay, is there an organic binder involved? If there's an organic binding agent involved in the, because you don't necessarily just apply a pigment, usually from a plant or a mineral, often from a mineral or charcoal to the surface, right? Okay, charcoal, you could date, right? This isn't charcoal though, right? It doesn't appear black or gray, so it's not charcoal. Is there an organic binder? Well, I don't know. Was it mentioned in the article? No, the way they did this is not even carbon-14 dating. It's by uranium dating. So you're actually going to get much better resolution on dates with uranium dating at this age, because 40,000 years is a pretty long time. You're really stretching the ability of carbon dating at that point. So, okay, they dated very tiny trace amounts of uranium that are in the calcium deposits that you see kind of creeping in onto the pictographs. So that's pretty neat, right? What they came back with was a date of more or less 45,500 years, which is about 1,000 to 1,500 years before other early dates in Indonesia. So that pushes back Indonesian rock art that would predate much of the earliest stuff we know from European Paleolithic caves. But the thing is when we're doing dating techniques like this, there are error bars around that, right? So it's like you might say 14,500, but that could be, give or take uh, a, a lot of a lot of time actually when it's that far back. So especially European archaeologists who specialize in Upper Paleolithic parietal art, cave art, wall art, rock art, as we often say here in the Americas. Um, European Paleolithic rock art specialists have objected to these findings and are currently challenging the resolution of this uranium dating technique. So possibly, if that date holds, it would be the world's oldest known pictograph to date. But again, it's challenged. And I do like to try to present both sides of the debate. Uh, we do have other rock art from 40,000 to 44,000 years old in Indonesia, and there was at the time a strong connection between Indonesia, Melanesia, and Australia because I mean the land masses were different. It was actually easier to travel between them than it would be today. So yeah, there's also old pictographs in Australia, and Australian pictographs tend to push uh, back to around that 40,000 year limit. And also interestingly, like people were there for much longer than that too. People arrived in Australia. Depending on who you ask, between 50 and 60,000 years ago. Sort of the conservative consensus is 50 to 55,000 years ago. Um, People have been in Australia for a long time, right? And so whether there are older pictographs in Indonesia, Melanesia, or Australia is kind of jury's still out on that. And then there's also the question, what changed in 10, 15, 20,000 years that uh, that suddenly we start seeing the rock art, um, but not necessarily seeing it from the earliest peoples arriving there. That's a good question, and that's kind of outstanding. The jury is still out on it, I should say. All right, moving on from the pictograph, we've got the 19th century Tlingit fort. This is in what's now Alaska, and yeah, so this is a little over 200 years ago. Uh, Russians were in the area that had actually claimed parts of what is now Alaska for largely for fur trapping. Of course, there's probably some other support industries like logging to produce boats, shelters, and that. But the main economic export from Russia's presence in Alaska is or was fur trapping. And in fact, they expanded their influence in the first half of the 19th century to include Alaska, the coast of British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, and even down into Northern California. They made it to uh, essentially what's now Napa and Sonoma valleys. Um, so that's pretty interesting. And if you go into like North Bay, like San Francisco Bay Area, but north, sort of like Marin and north of Marin, you start to see the remaining influence of that more orthodox churches than you would see, versus anything from like Monterey South. You see almost exclusively like the old churches and missions. Of course, would be the Catholic influence. So. Yeah, Russians were in North America on the West Coast for a little while, and this study was about an event that occurred, uh, sort of conflict between Russians and the indigenous Tlingit people. So anyone out there who studies the Pacific Northwest should know that Tlingit are pretty widely known for their art. Um, and yeah, just look up Tlingit art. It's very beautiful and still a living art tradition today. So Tlingit who are living today, some of them still make art inspired by this traditional style. It's really great. Check it out. And art's going to come back up again later in this talk. But that's not what this is about. This is about a fort that was located in, again, what's now Alaska. And so we had the Russians establish their fort. And so then the Tlingit fortified their own positions. And yeah, eventually a battle ensued. And the Russians did end up winning the battle, and the Tlingit fort was abandoned. This is both recorded in Russian historical documents and remembered in Tlingit oral traditions. And there's actually a lot of agreement between the Tlingit oral traditions and the Russian written records. So archaeologists and historians for a while had a pretty good idea of where this fort should be, more or less, and they finally kind of honed in on it. And what's interesting to note is the techniques that were used. So we're going to start off with the remote sensing, and you can kind of see that they've kind of highlighted some areas there. And I'm going to bring up a sketch of the fort itself there, so you can kind of see parallels in the shape between what was detected and what's historically documented there. Actually, pretty similar, right? So how did they do this? This isn't necessarily a shovels in the ground type of thing, right? The identification of the location and of the features was first done by what we call remote sensing, which is anything we do before we start disturbing things. And they used two different techniques and have combined them into that one nice, easy to see graphic up there, the top one. And we've got in the colors magnetometry, which is a way of sensing the changes in the strength and alignment of the magnetic field in the ground, and in anything that's sort of electrically charged, anything that's potentially magnetic mineral is going to have some sort of magnetic signature. And this includes like salts that are developed in the ground. This is actually a very sensitive type of instrumentation. And we see this weird kind of like speckled staticky area in the sort of, in that area that they have in the oval that says EM anomaly. That lines up very well with their ground penetrating radar data, which they have an inset scaled to the same size set just above. Well, ground penetrating radar is exactly what it sounds like. You're using radar signals, which are radio waves that are sent into the ground and then reflect back up. So sometimes using magnetometry doesn't really work so well, depending on the types of soils that you're working with. For example, I have experience working in Hawaii, and I know from my colleagues in Hawaii that, especially on volcanoes, there are just too many magnetic minerals that are not just aligned with the lava flows, but as soon as they erode, some of that alignment gets thrown out. So it's very difficult to detect features with the magnetometry alone. So when you combine methods like this, you're sort of hedging your bets. And so we've got the magnetometry and the ground penetrating radar, and the radar showed that there is something right where the magnetometry said it was, and then you compare it to this historic illustration, and it pretty closely matches the layout of the Tlingit fort. So that's pretty cool. Identifying features like that using remote sensing. These are pretty advanced techniques. These are late 20th century techniques, but they're as advanced as our techniques go. And I thought this was a great article to kind of show something that archaeologists can do. All right. Next would be shamans in Algeria. See if we got the picture here. There we go. So let's move that one over just a little. Yeah, there we go. Just having the text peeking out from under it kind of bothers me. This is actually similar. We see similar figures around the world. I can think of, there was a 1965 book chapter by Peter First, who's fairly well known for research into, well, some now call entheogens, botanical substances or botanical sources of mind-altering substances that are used in a religious context. There's some stuff in Mesoamerica where you have figures like this, a figure with mushrooms sprouting out of it. This one probably it has been known for a while, it appears. But this is, of course, a different corner of the world. This is Algeria, which is North Africa, just east of Tunisia and Libya. So this is pretty cool, from about 9,000 years ago. And yeah, the analysis is that, yeah, this is probably somebody who's ingesting some species of psilocybe mushroom, likely, but not necessarily Psilocybe cubensis. So not your red and white speckled amanitas, but more what people today call magic mushrooms, and entering into a altered state of consciousness. And we have other cues of this altered state of consciousness besides the mushrooms too, right? So the patterning on the body and whatever this is between the legs, if that's a gown or something, appears to be what we call an entoptic image, something that we see that emerges from within the visual system, whether it's in the visual cortex in the back of the head or in the retina and nerves leading to it. But also we have this transformation mask that has been nicknamed the bee-faced shaman. So, okay, interesting, right? Not necessarily a bee. Not really sure. Right. This is some level of interpretation that may be taking an extra leap and calling him bee-faced. But yeah, there we go. We talked about shamanism last fall, I think around the fall equinox. So here we go. Here it is in the news. All right. And now after the Algerian shaman, finally we have Acoustics and Feasting at Cahokia. This is an article actually about quote unquote lost cities. The idea being not necessarily that we are finding a lot of new lost cities, although maybe I'm going to recap this next month. There was just one that came out about using remote sensing to document a Maya city in Mesoamerica that has not even been excavated yet. So, but this is more about finding what's sort of lost in front of us. It's known and excavated, but the public may not generally be aware about it. So the author of the article, Annalee Liwosz, shared info about a lot of different indigenous urban environments from antiquity, from around the world. And one of the ones she emphasized, I believe, the first one she emphasized was Cahokia, which is outside of St. Louis. This is actually one of my favorite places to go. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but and as far as the administrative level goes, it's really a county park. There's a freeway that goes just north of the site core. There's another road that goes right through the middle of the site, and it's somewhat disturbed. But what's interesting is that now it's brought up some recent research into the acoustics of Cahokia. And for those of you who've been following our channel since last year, around last June, I gave a Mesa talk about conserving sonic heritage, and even brought up that the site core at Cahokia has been very much disturbed, but that this is actually a place that where we should make efforts to preserve the acoustics, because the acoustics of these like large plaza spaces and of these spaces around these very high mound features were probably very important in the past. And so that's one of the things that that Liwosz brought up. There are some contentious things and this is from the Science Friday podcast again. Link over here. There we go. And of course, down in the description as well. Now, the author also said some things about Cahokia, like there wasn't any evidence of widespread trade, that everything, economic products were mostly internal. Certainly produced a lot of their own agricultural products, but Cahokia actually has some exotic trade items from 1,000 or more miles away. So it actually did have quite a wide reach in its trade network. Sorry, that's a part of that article that's just a little bit inaccurate. They had a wide-reaching trade network. We have things from all over. They were trading with other societies in the Great Lakes region. They were trading with folks from the northern plains. They were trading with folks from. We see evidence of connection, of course, with the plains, possibly with the Southwest, and likely with the Gulf Coast. And there's been suggestions that the Gulf Coast, in turn, was at least somewhat connected to Mesoamerica. Those are getting to tenuous arguments, but the idea that Cahokia wasn't trading, they were a major city-state in Antiquity for hundreds of years, and so they were trading, and they were part of a vast trade network that was continent-wide, and that's kind of important. So there we go. That's archaeology in the news, and next we get to Mimbres and Mogollon. So this is a viewer-requested topic. It is addressing Mimbres and Mogollon sort of together. So it actually just kind of works out that recently there were some articles published in, there we go, in American Antiquity, which is one of the premier journals. There we go. Which is one of the premier journals for archaeology in the Americas. American Antiquity usually covers North America. We've got Latin American Antiquity for Central and South America. So yeah, there was an article on each in this. So we're going to talk about two of these articles and go into a little bit more detail. Again, that just like a little bit of the font peeking out there. Just kind of, there we go. That bothers me. My software has been acting up, so things are getting out of alignment. Like I said, my audio's been sort of resetting itself. Anyhow, okay, so Mogollon. A little bit of background on Mogollon first. Mogollon is one of the well-known southwestern cultures. It in New Mexico, it was especially present in the southwest of what is now New Mexico, but it also extended into Arizona, Sonora, and Chihuahua. So the Mogollon culture area spans two nation states today, the United States and Mexico. So this is actually one of those great examples of why it's important to share data between countries and across language barriers. So here we go. Don't be too distracting now. So in Southwest New Mexico, Arizona, as well as the Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, it was loosely contemporary with some other southwestern cultures like Basket Maker and early Pueblo, as well as Fremont. also loosely contemporary with Hohokam. But again, all these have their own chronologies. They were distinct cultures despite sharing a lot of similarities. They're pretty distinct in their own rights. So we're just focusing on Mogollon at this point. Um, so time periods and defining traits, which is also important for getting a sort of orientation into, there we go. We've got the late Archaic. Okay. Mogollon really starts to emerge in the late Archaic. We don't really call it Mogollon at that point, but we start to see some of the things that are very defining of Mogollon appearing at that time. We've got maize agriculture being adopted. We've got people living in pet houses next to these agricultural fields. And so that leads us into the Mogollon pit house period. Yeah, that leads us into the Mogollon pit house period, about 200 to 1000 AD. Recent research that's come out has sort of refined this to about 170 to 1020. But for the sake of this lecture, let's take broad strokes. Archaeology has funny resolution when it comes to dates anyhow. If you need to remember some dates, easy is to remember 200 to 1000. It's a little bit finer grained than that, but yeah, so the Mogollon pit house period is roughly contemporaneous with basket maker and early Pueblo. It's divided into 4 phases: early, Georgetown, San Francisco, and 3 circle. Not 3 circles, 3 circle. And then out of the Mogollon culture develops a regional variant called Mimbres around the Mimbres River, and Mimbres really hits its height in what's called the Mimbres Classic, as well as the Post-Classic. So this is from 1000 to 1450 AD. So leading up to it, it does seem to vanish before contact, but not long before. In fact, we have stories written down by conquistadors who had employed indigenous guides to lead them to various cities that they would then, sort of ransack and set themselves in charge of. And it's interesting that people referred to a major city in places like post-classic Mimbres centers. We're talking about 2 or 3 generations after they've sort of depopulated, but interesting that the memory is still there of these places as a significant place. So yeah, Mimbres, very interesting. We've got the classic, the terminal classic, and the early and late post-classic. Interesting example would be the site of Paquime, also known as Casas Grandes, which was a major post-classic city in the Mogollon region. So if we're going to focus on Mogollon first, and then we're going to move into Mimbres. So the Mogollon article, I really liked this one. This was by Lori Barkwill Love, and it's kind of important to understand some theories that go behind this to understand the questions. So we'll define those two. What Lori and other archaeologists have observed is that Mogollon settlement patterns change throughout the pit house periods. They move from sort of hilltops and knolls down to the first terrace above a river, so just high enough that it normally shouldn't flood. But also, as this time goes on, that movement means that they've got better access to agricultural features. One of the questions that other researchers have asked is, well, why did they start on these hilltops and knolls? Is that a defensive thing? So Lori's coming at this from a different angle, though, and is coming at it from both a methodological and theoretical standpoint. We mentioned dating techniques with the Sulawesi pictograph and how they didn't use carbon-14 for that. Well, Lori's using carbon-14 as a part of her analysis. But like I said, when it comes to what we call radiometric dating, whether it's carbon, uranium, or thorium is another thing that we can use. Potassium argon is another type of radiometric date that we can use. The point being is that Lori is using carbon-14, but with all of these, there are error bars, right? So you've got your kind of center date, you've got your like 1 and 2 sigma, for those of you who remember stats. So you've got like it's pretty likely that it's in here, 50 to 60% that it's in here. It's more than 90% probably in here, like 99% that it's in here, right? So for greater certainty, you get lower resolution. So what Lori's trying to do is increase that resolution by correlating these carbon-14 dates with other ways of dating artifacts and features. And so we know that there is a shift between people living in pit houses and people living in rectangular structures, very similar and roughly contemporaneous with what happens in the Pueblo world, which is we have in Basket Maker people living in these pit houses, and then like especially in Basket Maker 2, so that looks very, very much like the Archaic period which preceded it. By late Basket Maker 3 and early Pueblo 1, people are moving out of those, and so then the in-ground circular features are no longer residential, but they're ceremonial spaces, what we call kivas, which is probably a connection to ancestors. So by combining this and pottery, we know pottery styles change over time, and we've got a pretty good idea of the sequence of that. Go on, go get it. Go get the ball. Go get the ball. Go on. I'm sorry, she wants attention. I did just play with her right before doing this video, but yeah, what can you do? She's still very, very puppyish, and it's still very cute. So yeah, combining these different dating techniques, can we say something with more fine-grained resolution? And that fine-grained resolution is, are these residential features different houses that were occupied all at the same time? What would look like a village? Because it certainly, if you look at the site that that this researcher was investigating, then it kind of from above, from a bird's eye view, looks like a village, right? But that can also happen over a longer period of time with fewer residences, with one or two residences at any given time, in which case it wouldn't be a village, right? That would be more like a family plot. And so we distinguish between these theoretically in archaeology by what is a village? Well, a village socially is a bunch of different families, households, collecting their domestic spaces somewhat together, living in a consolidated residential area. What does it look like archaeologically? Well, we make a lot of inferences, and that's true for this site too, is it's often been referred to as a village because it looks like there's a lot of residences right next to each other. But there's another idea which was first proposed in the Southwest and is used in other areas, which is the idea of a persistent place. And that's just a place that people come back to and use and reuse over a long period of time, centuries, millennia. There are many reasons why someone might do this, but what we might see archaeologically, especially before we excavate and do any kind of analysis, a persistent place might, from the surface, look a lot like a village, right? Because, like I said, that those structures can look kind of the same. So, yeah, Lori Barkwill Love looked at a particular site in the Mogollon region, found that the initial occupation in what's called the aceramic pit house. You know, I said that there's this sort of transition that goes on in the late Archaic, in which Mogollon kind of, I need to give her toys that don't have squeakers in them. Go get it. There we go. So we've got this aceramic pit house that's like that late Archaic agriculturists that are starting to look like Mogollon before official Mogollon. And the occupation extended probably to about 910 to 1120, with the most intensive use being between the years 730 and 780. This is a long use period, and what Lori found was that when you correlate all these different dating techniques, is that you actually have few buildings that stood at any given time. It's that you have one or two buildings here, one or two, maybe you have a residence, ceremonial space, and a granary. And then throughout time, one set of those is abandoned or it goes into disuse, and then another set comes into use. So this looks more like what we call a consistent or a persistent place. So why? Well, why would you have a persistent place? One theory as consistent agricultural productivity, which is probably true for this site. So there is a pragmatic side that is important to note. But there's also, we know culturally that access to ancestors and an ancestral place would also be a motivating factor as well. And if any of you in like the Midwest or in like Western Pennsylvania might notice that in established farming plots, you've got like a little cemetery off into the corner, right? The family plot. Most of the names in the cemetery are the same. So that kind of thing, we do believe went on in Mogollon and Mimbres, was that once people became tied to place, especially once ancestors are in that place, that it creates a very strong connection. And so having access to the ancestors was probably very important as well. And speaking of Mimbres, so we've got Mimbres Classic period that develops out of Mogollon. For those of you familiar with sort of we would say now the Midwest, archaeologically, we say the Eastern Woodlands, the mound builders of what's now the Ohio area. There was the Adena culture of mound builders, and their sort of what's termed their cultural zenith, or sort of height, we call Hopewell. Hopewell being a type of Adena, similar to Mimbres here in the Southwest, emerging out of Mogollon. In other areas, Mimbres is contemporary with Mogollon 5 and Mogollon Pueblo. If you want to make this distinction between the Mimbres subregion and other parts of Mogollon extending into the Classic period, I might use that different terminology too. Because it might refer to the subregion that's sort of focused around the Mimbres River. Best known for highly distinctive pottery, somewhat inspired by Mogollon pottery, is known for sort of red on brown. In Mimbres, they might still use the same underlying, we call it the paste, some of the same underlying clay, but we've got this black on white. It's very distinctive, right? So then there's this white slip. And again, if there's a ceramicist in the audience, and if I'm wrong, just call me out, correct me in the chat. Looks like this video is going to run a little long too, but yeah. So we've got Mimbres, and this is very distinctive pottery. You've probably seen this image before, and then if we're to bring up that cover again, these are designs from Mimbres pottery. Very distinctive, very typical of Southwest, like the Southwest of the Southwest, and also of North and West Mexico, because again, spans kind of spans a national border. But really, this is a very New Mexico thing, because the core of Mimbres is in New Mexico. And so what we've got is that, well, this is the headline article for the latest issue of American Antiquity. And it's a pretty cool study, I'm not going to lie. So the analysis includes pottery. It's mostly focused on the designs of pottery. So this is where there's kind of a tie-in to what we do here with petroglyphs. Is there's we do classification and analysis the on the designs, on the motifs. And we see a lot of shared themes. So this is actually very interesting to read. But some or a lot of these in the analysis, I think about a third in the analysis, were from burial contexts, including some of the illustrations in the article. I don't want to show grave goods on this channel out of respect. It's not necessarily that there's something scholastically wrong with that, but this is a very public outlet, and we don't think it would be appropriate for this channel. So sorry, folks, I won't be showing you a lot of the illustrations there, but we've got the cover, and those do not appear to be from grave contexts. So what did they find? Well, they find that, there's no design that's particular to a village, but there do seem to be, when we analyze what the paint is made out of, what the clay is made out of, we find that there's strong evidence that single artists developed their own variations on this Mimbres style. So that's pretty cool. But that single artist's work get distributed throughout the whole Mimbres area. And when we have evidence that people came in from neighboring regions into Mimbres, they took up Mimbres pottery and used Mimbres pottery. And some of these folks even went on to produce Mimbres-inspired pottery. So it seems to be a way of signaling, I belong here. Whether... There we go. You can play, but you can't keep it. You can't keep interrupting, babe. So it signals, I belong here. Both in the sense of those who might be born into Mimbres society and those who marry into Mimbres society, that they are pushing aside their prior identity and adopting this Mimbres identity by consuming and even sometimes producing this highly stylized pottery. So just having Mimbres pottery shows that these folks from outside of Mimbres have been accepted into and have accepted a role in Mimbres society. But what we find from these highly stylized images is that there we go. Is that there's a lot of room for individual artistic expression. That there certainly are conventions that artists followed, such as animals are depicted in profile except for reptiles, which are depicted in from the top down, versus humans who can be portrayed face on or in profile, and birds as well kind of cross this line. So yeah, there's conventions that they follow, but within this, you see all these elaborations on the insides of these designs, and those are a part of the individual artist's work. The way that they incorporate different designs, merge different designs, render individual animals within the frameworks of convention, allowed for a lot of room for creativity, for individual artistic expression, which is pretty darn neat. Because as the authors note, that a lot of traditional visual culture, a lot of traditional art, constrained artists a bit much, and so we don't get to see distinctive individual artists in a lot of other traditions because they're too constrained to be able to display this sort of creativity. But in Mimbres, the individual artist could express themselves, and that's what really makes this interesting. I don't know if you can see that notification or not. I just wanted to go away. There we go. Artists make this exciting. So there we go. We've got our references here. I'm gonna turn my camera off so you can see these. There we go. References, as always, are also down in the description below. And yeah, there's a second page to this, as there usually is. I thought this was going to be a short reference list, and then we've got like 2 pages, like 2 full pages of references. But yeah, check out, I've included links for all the archaeology in the news, as well as the citations for these American antiquity articles. So that's it for the mini lecture, and for archaeology in the news. We're going to pop on over here very quickly to, yes, dog, checking in on the chat. I don't really see any comments in the chat. If you have any questions or comments, always feel free to check in on the chat. Post them throughout the video. I mean, like, maybe I don't get to it until the end, but always, I'm happy to stay on here for a few minutes at the end if you have any questions. So pop them in whenever you think about them. Yeah, thank you. Always happy. So yeah, you're welcome. And yeah, Tlingit are pretty awesome. Well, you know about the totem poles and that. I know you've read that book on how to make a totem pole. It goes through the process and conventions of that particular artistic style. So yeah. And then you can always I'll get notifications if you're watching this on replay, because these are automatically posted to YouTube. So for anyone who's out there that you're watching this, maybe you're not watching it live, you can pop down in the comments, try to get back to you, try to answer in follow-ups. Thanks, Luke, and yeah, thank you for tuning in. Thank you, both of you, for tuning in. Yeah, you can make comments. We'll reply to them and try to get back to you on air in the subsequent video. You can always email me. You can find my contact information on the Mesa Prieta website, mesaprietapetroglyphs.org, and that's a great place to find updates on tours and events. Like I said, we're going to try to do things. We're of course going to be responsible about public health and safety and the health and safety of everyone involved with our project, but we hope to be able to bring you something this year. Yeah, see you next month. See you all next month. Yeah. Oh, and don't forget to tune in, because we're planning on having Professor Liwosz Bork from Highlands University come give a guest talk. So yeah. All right. Ciao.